while Iran mourned its late Supreme Leader. The U.S. marked its 250th Independence Day, highlighting a stark contrast that could shape the future of U.S. Iran diplomacy. One nation mourned while the other celebrated, as the U.S. and Iran projected sharply contrasting messages over the weekend. We'll explore what they reveal about the future of U.S.-Iran diplomacy. Joining me today is Professor Hannah Kim. Hello, Professor Kim.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. And also here in this studio, we have invited Thomas Maresca. Good afternoon, Thomas.
Hi, thanks. Great to be here.
Thomas, I'd like to start with you. Iran began the funeral ceremonies over the weekend for its late former leader, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, with services continuing through July 9th. One of the biggest questions now is whether his successor will make a public appearance. What is the latest on that for now?
Yeah, that's not the only story, but definitely a big story around this funeral.
Right.
And we haven't, there's been no sign of his successor, his son, Mojtaba Khamenei. We've seen almost everyone else kind of appear. His three other sons have shown up, and really, it's almost the first time, all the sort of leading figures, political and military figures have been there. His body was being in Tehran for the past few days. Now this procession is starting today, and then it's going to travel throughout the country. But yeah, that's been one of the big questions. Since the strike by U.S. and Israel that killed the father, Ali Khamenei, we know that Mojtaba Khamenei was also severely injured, and several of the other family members were killed. And really, since that time, he hasn't been seen nor heard from at all. I mean, there's been messages from him, but there's been no recording, video, photos.
Absolute absence.
Yeah, so there's just, this is only kind of furthering that question. I mean, there's been all sorts of speculation as to how injured is he, is he even alive, and those sorts of questions. So this is, not answering any of those clearly. I mean, some have said that, he isn't appearing because there are threats, threats of assassination possibly from Israel, which is, not an invalid sort of concern. But generally speaking, it's going to continue to surround the sort of mystery around what happened to him. At the moment, it's not maybe the main thing, because so much is going on with this funeral in general, and it's it is this big show from Iran of kind of defiance and sort of force, and there's been a lot of images, I think you've been showing them on the channel of just the huge crowds that turn out. It's been apparently 20 million maybe they're expecting overall, and there's clearly a sense of defiance, and survival by the regime, and they're certainly playing up this kind of martyrdom of Khamenei, and there's clearly is anger among the population on the streets.
Indeed.
And, but it still is. So for now, I think this is the messaging. I mean, but there still are questions that will continue along. I mean, this is kind of this moment in the war, but I think the questions, and this may come back to what, where is Mojtaba? What role does he have? Will be maybe when things settle a bit, and how is this regime going to sort of manage things going forward? Who's really in power now? I mean, these are questions now that are even surrounding. There's a lot of looking at the videos of the footage and seeing, the parliament speaker Ghalibaf is there, and the foreign minister Arirang are there, and sort of people are trying to suss out, are they? How did they look at each other? There's all this kind of reading of tea leaves. So that's going on.
So much analysis.
Yeah. So, right now, I mean, obviously, at some point going forward, I think these questions are going to become more significant, and it certainly is something that people are asking about
Indeed.
now. But so, we'll have to see what happens.
Well, another question is the funeral date. It kicked off on July 4th, which
Yeah.
is Independence Day in the U.S. Professor Kim, that is a date that many see as politically symbolic. Do you think Washington could view this as a deliberate provocation in any sense?
I mean, it's hard to call the timing purely coincidental. Khamenei died on February 28th, and Iran kept postponing the funeral for months before finally holding it now, which means that Tehran could have easily chosen any date other than America's 250th Independence Day, but it didn't. And of course, Iran delayed the funeral for 4 months over security concerns as well. Now, a supreme leader's funeral brings together senior government officials and top Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders, and they're all in one place. And so holding it in the middle of an active war would have exposed them to all the risks of a US or Israeli strike. So the most plausible reading of this situation is that Iran held off until a ceasefire with the US was in place. And then only then did it deliberately schedule the funeral to coincide with America's 250th Independence Day. And so for Tehran, holding its supreme leader's funeral alongside this Independence Day or July 4th could amplify the domestic narratives of martyrdom or resistance. And it also sends a symbolic message outwards. And from Washington's side, Trump's own he commented that he gave Iran a week off for the funeral. And this suggests that the administration is framing this as evidence of its own restraint rather than treating it as a provocation. So with negotiations already stalled, this kind of symbolic friction could further cool down the atmosphere for future talks rather than help it.
Well, speaking of negotiations between the U.S. and Iran, Thomas, then the U.S. and Iran held another round of indirect talks in Doha back on the 1st of July, but obviously they made a little progress. Now, there are so many reports on why the talks are still stalled. What are the sticking points at the moment?
Well, these talks came after some flare-ups around the Strait of Hormuz. Iran had fired on some ships that they sort of were not happy with the paths that they were taking through, and the U.S. responded with some strikes. And so, when these talks started, I mean, they were still kind of going back to issues that apparently, were supposed to have sort of been settled by the MOU that was signed a couple of weeks beforehand. So really, they kind of were starting with things that, were supposed to have been clear. They were supposed to have been, the strait was supposed to be opened. The U.S. was lifting the military blockade, and and all the things that were supposed to be discussed in this 60-day period, with something like the nuclear program, the future of that, et cetera, apparently really weren't touched on in these meetings. We don't know exactly what was said. I mean, both sides have kind of given different accounts, but from Tehran's side, they were basically saying the main things they talked about were the U.S. violating its obligations under the MOU, and some discussion about releasing some of the frozen funds, $6 billion of the frozen funds, and these were sorts of things that, were supposed to have already been kind of resolved, and this was, and so, it's. Some of it may just be the realities and on the strait not really, being settled in the way that they'd like it to. But I think it's also, and I'm sure Professor Kim can speak more to this, but I think people have been commenting that, this is sort of out of the Iran negotiation playbook of, just this history of kind of dragging things out, and not, bringing things back up that were supposed to have been resolved. And I've seen, I saw one reference to it as kind of bazaar diplomacy, like shopping bazaar, like, this idea of haggling in the marketplace. And that really appears to be kind of a fundamental approach that Iran takes towards these negotiations. I mean, J.D. Vance was talking in the aftermath of the talks just about sort of saying he called it a Persian negotiating tactic and saying he didn't understand it, but it's something where there's a sense of tireless bargaining. And I think, even people that worked on the 2015 JCPOA, the, Obama era, nuclear deal, said also, it took so long to get to places. And, for Iran, it's kind of, they seem happy to stay on these issues and maybe let, the bigger things they don't want to talk about linger on and on and on. At the same time, obviously Iran at some point does need to get something out of these talks, I think, as well. Just they have their own economic interests going forward. But I saw one comment in one of the stories from the Wall Street Journal reporting on it, and one analyst was saying this may be the first and last deal they ever sign, this MOU.
Wow.
The way these things could just sort of potentially, be this kind of constant state, not a constant state of war, but maybe a constant state of these, on and off negotiations.
That is an interesting point. Well, I'd like to turn back to how you framed Iran's tactics or even bargaining strategies. Turning to Professor Kim, some analysts argue the current stalemate actually benefits Iran, allowing it to avoid concessions on the red lines while steering discussions toward preferred issues. What is Tehran trying to achieve here?
I think this U.S. Iran MOU itself already tilts in Iran's favor. Tehran effectively retains control over Hormuz, and especially in terms of its transit fees. And the nuclear provisions are widely seen as weaker than the 2015 JCPOA. And so given that, Iran has little incentive to rush. And it appears to be steering negotiations towards more favorable issues. So sanctions relief, reconstruction funding, transit fees. And it's also pushing the harder red lines like enriched uranium, disposal and nuclear facility access, as well as down the road, all of these things as far as possible. And so the strategy likely reflects a calculation about how domestic rallying effects differ between the two countries. In the U.S., opposition to this war has been strong, and even a fair number of Trump's own MAGA supporters have been uneasy about this. And with the midterm elections coming up this November, Trump has real incentive to wind this conflict down quickly. And Iran, by contrast, has strong anti-government sentiment before the war, but the war itself triggered a rally around the flag effect domestically. And the Supreme Leader's funeral was staged against that backdrop. So the funeral is being used to rally national unity around a martyrdom and victory type of narrative. And this reduces the political incentive to come. So, of course, Trump can't offer Iran unlimited concessions, and Iran isn't immune to economic strain, nor will the unifying effect of the funeral last indefinitely. But this kind of prolonged low-intensity deadlock looks like it's going to be the most likely path forward.
Well, Professor Kim, you said Iran is not rushing. Does that mean the prolonged deadlock could last weeks or months?
I mean, it could potentially take. It really depends on the situation, but rather than us seeing a full collapse or full resolution in the near future, it's most likely that it's going to end up being a deadlock for at least a good period of time.
I see. Well, Thomas, there are some also interesting reports on how Israel attempted to assassinate members of Iran's negotiating team during U.S. Iran negotiations. And apparently Washington warned Tehran about the assassination attempt. What are the reports about?
This was mainly, I think, came from some New York Times reporting initially. As you mentioned, apparently there was concern from the American side that Israel was targeting these two officials that I mentioned earlier. It was Abbas Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister, and Mohammad Bagher Kalibaf, the Speaker of Parliament, who are kind of the top two figures in the negotiations. And there was some concern that Israel was targeting them right during this period of the ceasefire negotiations during April. And again, according to officials that were quoted or cited in the story, the U.S. went so far as to ask other countries in the region to warn Iran about the possibility of these Israeli attacks against the officials, and it's. Obviously it's based on background reporting. We don't know exactly, but clearly, this is it follows a sort of pattern that's emerged since the start of the war, where you can see this divergence in, the U.S. Goals and the Israeli goals, as far as how to wrap this up or to proceed with it. And I think earlier on, there was this sense that Israel had been, Israel's strategy from early on was to target top leadership, and they did clearly wipe out a lot of top leaders towards the earlier stages of the attacks. But then, during this period of the U.S. trying to get some kind of a peace deal down, obviously the Americans were afraid that this would derail the entire thing, and so in response to that article, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called it fake news, and there really hasn't been, Trump, the latest of that actually is that Trump just a couple of days ago told Axios that Prime Minister Netanyahu requested a White House meeting and maybe visiting as early as next week, and Trump said, quoted by Axios as saying that, we get along very good. Netanyahu knows who the boss is, so you can see this kind of where this relationship sort of stands. It's something that, remains kind of a sticking point just in whatever goes forward with any of these peace negotiations. I mean, another big issue has been Israel and Lebanon and the fighting on that front. And, a couple of times already there's been, strikes between Israel and Lebanon. And, there was a lot of reporting last month that Trump was, furious with Netanyahu for Israel conducting some strikes on Lebanon. This is an issue that Iran is also keeping at the negotiating table, saying, this has to be part of the whole ceasefire package. Is Israel, not attacking Lebanon and removing sort of some of its forces from that's inside the country, and Israel sort of maintaining it has its right to defend itself. So we don't know exactly what the details of that story were, but it doesn't strain credulity to think some version of that.
Well, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu tried to tame the rumor, but I asked this question because there are also analysis that this Washington's reported concern over the assassination attempt suggests that U.S. and Israeli objectives are beginning to diverge. Is that so, Professor Kim?
I think the relationship between the two is very interesting. But, from the outset, Trump has emphasized that he hasn't started a new war during his term, which is then framing it as one of his key achievements. And his administration's national security strategy has also prioritized the Western Hemisphere while treating the Middle East as a relatively low priority. But it was also repeated that Netanyahu's persuasion, it was his persuasion that ultimately drew the U.S. into this conflict with Iran. And so against that backdrop, as the war dragged on longer than expected, the gap between Washington and Israel has grown more visible. And I think that was what we were talking about earlier. But, the U.S. currently wants to end this conflict diplomatically, and it has also taken a very clear, pragmatic, deal-oriented stance towards this, while Israel has favored a more military line since the war began, and that includes strikes that killed Khamenei himself. So from Israel's perspective, Iran is now far weaker than it had been in the past, making this a very rare window of opportunity to resolve the Iran problem once and for all. But that's reportedly why Israel strongly opposed the ceasefire negotiations between the U.S. and Iran in the first place. So, yes, there's a gap in the approach that looks increasingly visible, but whether or not this really amounts to a genuine rift, because this is a very interesting relationship between the two leaders. So whether or not this is a genuine rift in the alliance is something that we need to continue to watch.
Indeed. Alrighty, Professor Kim, we'll have to wrap up our discussion here. Thank you for your insights as always.
Thank you so much.
And also, Thomas, thank you for your time as well. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we also thank you for staying with us. This has been Kim Dami. Goodbye.